He's 35 years old, still splitting rent with a roommate he found on Craigslist back in 2013. 4 different browser tabs open right now with online courses he signed up for and never finished. A gym membership he swipes maybe twice a month, mostly out of guilt. And somewhere in the back of his mind, there's another version of him, a more finished, more successful guy who's already made it, who just hasn't shown up to collect the life yet. If any part of that description made you flinch a little, stay with me. You're not lazy, you're not broken, you're running a very specific psychological pattern, and it actually has a name. Carl Jung called it pure eternus, Latin for eternal boy. It's the part of the male psyche that refuses to fully land in adulthood, that keeps circling the runway instead of touching down. Before we go further, I want to be clear about something. This isn't about intelligence, and it isn't about ambition. Some of the sharpest, most creative men you'll ever meet are caught in this exact loop. What actually defines it is closer to an allergic reaction to commitment. Not just romantic commitment, but commitment to a career, a city, a version of yourself you can't take back. Jung used another phrase for this that I think about a lot. The provisional life, meaning you're living like everything is a rough draft. The job is temporary, obviously, because you're clearly meant for something bigger. The apartment doesn't need decorating, because you won't be here long, supposedly, even though you've said that for 6 years. Running, the relationship is fine, sure, but you keep one eye on the door because, well, what if someone better's out there? It's less a life than a waiting room, and you've been sitting in it so long you've memorized the magazines. So where does this actually come from? Because nobody wakes up one day and decides to become allergic to their own future. You have to go back further than that. Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz, who worked closely with Jung and wrote the defining text on this exact syndrome, noticed something specific about the men who fall into it. A striking number of them were considered gifted as kids, the fast learner, the one teachers pulled aside to say you could really do something. That praise feels good going down, but it plants a strange belief underneath it, that your worth is tied to potential rather than output, and potential is a currency that only holds its value for as long as you never actually spend it. Then adulthood happens, and adulthood doesn't grade on potential, it grades on delivery. You take a real job, and you're mediocre at first, because everyone is. You get rejected. You watch guys with half your talent outpace you simply because they kept showing up on the boring days. For someone who built an entire identity around being the exception, that stings in a particular way. It feels less like disappointment and more like a threat to the whole self-image. So the mind does what minds do when they're threatened. It protects itself. This is where procrastination stops looking like laziness and starts looking like armor. If you never really try, you never really find out. You get to keep the fantasy intact. The one where if you had actually applied yourself, you'd have crushed it. Delaying the job application, delaying the manuscript, delaying the hard conversation. Every delay is a small, quiet trade. You give up a real shot at success in exchange for the guaranteed comfort of unproven potential. There's actual research behind why this stretch of life feels so slippery in the first place. Psychologist Jeffrey Arnett published a theory in the year 2000 in the journal American Psychologist describing a developmental stage he named emerging adulthood, roughly the late teens through the 20s, sometimes later. Arnett's work described this period as genuinely unstable by design, identity still forming, living situations shifting constantly, people reporting that they feel caught somewhere between adolescence and full adulthood, not quite either one. His point wasn't that this stage is some kind of character flaw. It's that modern life has stretched this window out longer than it used to be for pretty ordinary economic and social reasons. But his research also found that most people do eventually move through it. The eternal boy is what happens when someone gets stuck in that window instead of passing through it. So what does getting stuck actually look like day to day? Usually, it's quieter than people expect. Maybe it's the phone doom-crawling at midnight that started as just 5 minutes and somehow ate 3 hours. Or a relationship where you catch yourself cataloging your partner's flaws right when things start feeling permanent, as if finding a flaw gives you an exit you can use later. And there's often a running list somewhere in your head of reasons your boss or the economy or your parents made this harder than it should have been, some of which might even be true and none of which change what you actually do on Monday morning. That last one deserves a second look because it's the sneakiest of the bunch. Blaming your circumstances feels like clarity. It feels like you finally named the real enemy, but circumstances being real doesn't make them the whole story. And treating them like the whole story is just another more socially acceptable way of not showing up. Okay, so what actually breaks the loop? Not a montage, not some single morning where you wake up and suddenly want to do your taxes. The first shift has to happen in how you define growing up. Somewhere along the way, a lot of men start treating responsibility as the opposite of freedom. Like the day you commit to a job, a partner, a mortgage is the day the interesting version of you quietly dies. It's actually the reverse. A talent with no structure around it just evaporates over time. The guy with a great business idea and zero discipline for managing money doesn't have a business. He has a thought he enjoys thinking. Commitment isn't the cage. It's the scaffolding that lets whatever's inside you take an actual shape in the actual world. From there, it gets almost embarrassingly simple, though not easy. Do the boring task with background noise to numb it, clean the room, pay the bill on the day it's due, not 3 reminders later, and go looking for the specific failure you've been avoiding on purpose. Send the application to the company you're sure won't want you. Take the class where you'll be the worst one in the room for a while. Each time you survive a small real failure instead of an imagined one, the fear underneath this whole pattern loses a little more of its grip on you. The Strait of Hormuz kept opening and closing like a valve under pressure. And trusting the word of the American president was nearly impossible because he could speak peace one moment and threaten war the next. Interestingly, the same period also saw a dramatic drop in oil prices. A White House economic advisor noted that crude, which had once neared $150 a barrel, had fallen back to around $60, roughly a 50% decline. Average gas prices in America also began easing. At first glance, this looks like things were improving, but experts weren't so sure. Some analysts believed Iran was deliberately choosing partial control over the strait, rather than a total permanent shutdown, as a way of signaling its regional power without triggering a full economic catastrophe. One expert bluntly noted that Iran depends heavily on the revenue generated from that waterway, since it directly funds its Revolutionary Guard's efforts to rebuild missile and drone stockpiles. So while Iran appeared to be sitting at the negotiating table, it was simultaneously, quietly rearming itself. And here's where an even more startling revelation surfaces. A US-based nuclear research institute claimed that inside Iran, a deeply fortified facility buried within a mountain, nicknamed Pickaxe Mountain, had continuously been active since at least 2020. In other words, at the very moment the world was discussing letting nuclear inspectors back into Iran, serious questions were being raised about whether Tehran was still secretly keeping its nuclear ambitions alive underground. American experts called this the true test of the entire agreement. If Iran genuinely halted work at that facility and allowed inspectors unrestricted access, it would be the clearest sign yet that it was ready to abandon its long pattern of deception. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan also made headlines during this period. Speaking in Istanbul, he directly accused Israel of deliberately trying to sabotage the US-Iran peace agreement. Erdogan claimed Israel's current government was addicted to war and would not hesitate to plunge the region back into gunpowder and bloodshed. This statement matters because it reveals that this fragile peace process wasn't just a two-country affair. The entire region was divided over it. Even inside Israel, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir openly declared that Trump's agreement does not bind us. In other words, a hardline faction within Israel itself was refusing to recognize the very document Washington was signing. Now you can understand why a headline like Trump instantly blows up peace talks isn't some exaggerated clickbait fantasy. It reflects something real. This wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was the culmination of months of grinding effort, dozens of meetings, and an endless cycle of agreements forming and collapsing. The hopeful breakthrough that emerged from the peaceful Swiss mountains was destabilized within hours by one aggressive Trump statement and Iran's decision to shut the strait once again. And this wasn't the first time either. Back in April, the 21-hour marathon talks in Islamabad had also collapsed without result, followed immediately by America's announcement of a naval blockade.